US states that are impossible to invade. I mean, is it ever impossible to invade somewhere? I mean, because like the US, even though I think you've got the Pacific and then the Atlantic, like if a country like China, just for example, really made it their mission to invade the US, even though the US would see them coming from quite some distance, doesn't the Chinese military have enough personnel, ships, and other things that it could send? Like, could the US take all of them out?
The United States boasts the largest combined Army, Navy, and Air Force. The United States boasts the largest combined Army, Navy, and Air Force in the world. In fact, if each of those branches was separated, they would still comprise the top 3 most powerful military presences in the world,
Really?
with China coming in 4th, and that's not
Wow.
including the Marines. But the United States is impenetrable so long as all the states work in tandem, hence the nation's name. But what about the individual states? If push came to shove, which states are the most likely to be able to repel an attack on their own? So which states would be virtually impossible to invade? There are no right or wrong answers to this, and for a few major reasons. First, apart from its early history as a collection of colonies, the United States as it exists today is so interconnected that it would be highly unlikely for a state that's not coastal or shares a border with another country to be the first point of an invasion. This cuts down the number of possible entry points into the country severely. Secondly,
Yeah.
the geography of the United States makes invading the country a particularly difficult ordeal. The US has coasts on both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. However, the Pacific coast is also heavily defended via natural mountain ranges that stretch practically all the way from the south to the north of the coast.
That's a good point, because like the soldiers from the invading country would need to get through those mountains, like unless they could find the path, the easiest path. But even if they found an easy path, they've still got to like scale mountains, so that would slow them down like hugely, wouldn't it?
If an enemy were to invade from the Pacific, they would have to mount an amphibious attack on the Pacific coast, and then nearly immediately have to cross high mountains to reach further into the country. The Atlantic coast is relatively flat in comparison, but even there you have the Appalachian Mountains relatively close by, effectively cutting off access to the central US states and the Mississippi Basin. Furthermore, the states that lie on the Atlantic coast are incredibly well connected via the interstate highway system. This means that the US military will have a much easier time mounting a counteroffensive and reinforcing that part of the border.
Good point. The bases, the US military has so many military bases everywhere that they could just like jump into action like whenever they win, like required.
Third, the US has created a geopolitical barrier to the north with Canada. That country that shares the long border is a fellow NATO member. Now, there's pretty much zero chance that Canada itself will be the one invading the US. However, Hudson
it's
Bay
never gonna
might be one of the
happen.
most likely entry points for an enemy to start its offensive. Since Canada is a member of NATO, it's obligated to come to the aid of the US in the event of a military conflict. As such, declaring war on the US would mean declaring war on Canada and vice versa. Even so, a particularly well-prepared enemy might risk going through Canada to get to the US anyway. The final possible entry point in the continental US would be the south. There, the US borders Mexico, which is reinforced by 2,500 National Guard members, who are also tasked with providing detection, monitoring, and aviation support. Additionally, some of the states on the southern border are among the most difficult to invade by themselves, which we'll discuss in a bit. But what
Quick question though, like regarding NATO, what about if the invading country persuaded Canada, for example, to cooperate with them? They would get something out of it, something huge. Like because in times of war and things like that, deals get broken all the time, don't they? So is NATO completely bulletproof? Who's to say some countries within NATO wouldn't like betray each other? Just hypothetically, of course. I'm not saying this is going to happen. It probably won't happen, but just thinking out possible scenarios.
What would make a single state relatively easy or difficult to invade? There are a few main factors that influence this. First is the state's natural defenses via its geographical location, either relative to other states, notable bodies of water or mountains, or proximity to other countries. The second is the state's access to the
Wow, look at that. Sorry, like It's like spaghetti.
Interstate system, or other major road, sea, and even airport connections. The third is the existing military presence in the state in the form of military bases. Finally, there's the Second Amendment factor, which is basically how many residents of the states carry weapons or own guns. While this last part might not sound as important as the first three, it could arguably be one of the biggest morale boosters that the US military and its residents can get. So what states have the right combination of these factors that would make it hard for a US enemy to invade? One of the perfect examples of why geography and national boundaries matter so much is seen in the first state on our list, Alaska. As one of two states that are not part of the contiguous US, Alaska is also the country's largest and northernmost state. These three factors combine to make Alaska practically invulnerable to invasion.
But how is it invulnerable to invasion? Because the population is so low. If a country was to send like a huge amount of its military to Alaska, like how quickly could the US, the contiguous US, deploy the amount of troops needed to combat the invading country? Because Alaska's so far away, isn't it? You got to get through Canada to get to Alaska, haven't you?
Let's delve into the state's geography. Alaska has roughly 586,000 square miles of harsh, icy landscapes, tundra, and subarctic forests. Despite the state's sheer size, it has only 730,000 residents, making it the most sparsely populated state in the US. This is due to large expanses of inhospitable and barren regions that make it extremely difficult to install proper infrastructure. The Alaskan coast, meanwhile, can be best described as a series of tight inlets that stretch for roughly 34,000 miles, making the mere prospect of a naval invasion difficult. Adding to the logistical troubles of invading Alaska is the aforementioned lack of extensive infrastructure. The state capital, Juneau, is inaccessible by road. Instead, it and the major towns that surround it are only connected to one another and the outside world via ferry services and airports. In the event of an invasion, the enemy would have to station its navy outside of the state capital, where it could get cut off by a counteroffensive from the US Navy that would come from the Pacific coast.
That's crazy. So you can't drive from Canada to Juneau. You have to drive somewhere close to Juneau and then get a ferry into the capital city of Alaska. That's nuts. That's crazy. I thought for sure you'd be able to drive to the capital.
After that, there's the problem of the state's isolation from the contiguous US. The state shares a border with Canada that's over 1,500 miles of relatively barren tundra, mountains, and harsh landscapes. Simply put, even if the state becomes a target for an invasion, it would likely end there. The US military can cut off all major routes to Canada and the rest of the US and mount a counteroffensive. But that's not all. Despite its relatively low population, the state of Alaska has a higher number of military bases and one of the highest ratios of servicemen to the general population. In total, there are 18,500 active service members of the US military in the state, spread across 9 military bases. But don't let the low numbers fool you. The Alaskan military bases are among the most well-defended, and its service members have access to world-class training. This is due to the availability of space that can be used for military exercises and tests.
Yeah, that would help out a lot, having the bases there so they don't have to come all the way from the contiguous US. They're literally right there, ready to get stuck in.
One of the country's largest training centers is the Joint Pacific-Alaska Range Complex, spread across 2,490 miles and connecting 1.5 million acres of maneuver land. The Department of Defense also spends significantly more money on the national defense of the state than its population would imply. With a national defense spending of $4.7 billion as of 2023, this comes out to approximately $6,350 per resident, ranking it the 4th state in per-resident spending on national defense. With all these factors in mind, it's easy to see why Alaska is so heavily defended. The state provides the US with easy access to both the Pacific and Arctic Oceans. Additionally, its relative proximity to both Russia and China means that the US has stationed its long-range ballistic rockets and anti-missile defenses there.
That's a good point. Alaska being so close to China and Russia, if one of those countries were to ever want to invade the US, it seems like that's where they would probably start. Because I think I looked at a map recently, and Alaska and Russia, I think once were actually connected, weren't they? The closest points to them today are they're really close. So, but Russia, they're not gonna. I mean, their military's nowhere near capable of invading the US.
further boosting the state's resilience against outside attacks. But it's not only the military that the enemy would have to worry about. Remember when we discussed the inhospitable environment? Well, Alaska is also home to polar bears, one of the world's largest land predators. Because of this and other reasons, over 64% of the population are registered gun owners,
Wow,
the third largest
2/3.
gun-to-resident ratio in the country. The residents of Alaska are typically more than capable and willing to defend themselves against intruders. The next state on our list of most difficult to invade might be a little surprising.
Texas?
Virginia. Alaska is naturally defended by its harsh coast and inhospitable terrain, but Virginia achieves that protection by being stuck between a rock and a hard place. The rock is the Appalachian Mountain Range at the western edge of the state. Its dense forest cover, mountainous terrain, and abundance of natural
Wow, look at that road. That is beautiful. Driving through here would be so much fun. It'd be hard for me to concentrate. I'd just be like, wow, look at that, look at that.
natural caverns, bridges, and sinkholes make foot traffic across the range potentially deadly. The hard place is the state's connection to the Atlantic Ocean, one that is filled with tidal bays that stretch for over 7,200 miles of highly fractured coast. Worse yet, much of the coast opens to swampy and low-lying terrain and is sprinkled with military bases. With the shoreline consisting of narrow bays that stretch for dozens of miles into the state, the military can easily control who or what can navigate the Chesapeake Bay, which accounts for a vast majority of Virginia's coast. Speaking of military bases, Virginia ranks among the top 5 states in the nation by number of bases. The state's largest base is Naval Station Norfolk, which houses over 47,000 active military personnel.
Wow.
While this is not even close
47,000. That's like the population of a small town. Like here in the UK at least. That's a lot of people.
to the largest military base in the nation overall, it is the largest naval base, supporting 75 ships and over 120 aircraft. This makes it one of the primary operating centers of the US Navy, which further disincentivizes a naval invasion. But it's not only the Navy that makes its headquarters in Virginia. The Pentagon itself is based in Arlington County, Virginia. This might make it arguably the most vital strategic target for an enemy to attack and therefore the most defended. Because of this, Virginia has the second highest number of active personnel, at roughly 125,000. Those numbers are further bolstered by the state's highway connectivity. It contains over a dozen interstate and highway connections to other states. While this convenient and abundant access might be considered a drawback if the state is successfully invaded, it also means that the US military has plenty of opportunity to bring in reinforcements and mount a counteroffensive. The state of Virginia's national defense contributions go beyond its military presence. While Virginia remains a key hub for defense activities, the Department of Defense invested $68.5 billion in the state in
$68.5 billion. That is just such... Did that come from the overall military budget? It probably did. That is huge. That is so much money. 68 billion.
2023, accounting for a significant portion of its economy. This represents approximately 10% of Virginia's GDP. However, Texas surpasses Virginia in total DoD spending, with $71.6 billion allocated to the Lone Star State.
These amounts of money are just jaw-dropping for me. Like billion with a B. Like that pays for a lot of stuff.
But while Texas is the state with the overall largest military budget, the next one has the most active soldiers within its borders. We're talking about California. The country's most populous state, at least for now, since Texas seems to be well on its way to taking that #1 spot, California is home to close to 160,000 active personnel and their families. These soldiers are spread out across dozens of bases within the state. In fact, California has the most military bases of all the states. California is also one of the states with the largest and busiest interstate network. While this usually means that people are spending hours upon hours in traffic, the sheer scale at which California's highways are being built gives it significant connectivity, both within the state and the states surrounding it.
But doesn't that also give connectivity to an invading country? Like if, you know, California has so much highway and roads, like if a country was to invade via the Pacific, got into California, they would have a clear route. If they were able to overwhelm the US forces in California, they would have a clear route into, you know, Arizona and other states, wouldn't they? Just, you know, hypothetically speaking, of course.
California boasts a highly variable landscape. containing the country's highest and lowest points in the contiguous US, those being Death Valley and Mount Whitney. The sheer variety in terrain across a relatively small area makes the state particularly difficult to cross without extreme preparation. Add to that the fact that the state doesn't have many freshwater locations, and an invading force will need to account for significant resources needed to trek over California. Additionally, the state has only 840 miles of shore, creating a relatively straight line from north to south. This makes the coast easily defensible by the US Navy. Because the coast can be accessed from the Pacific quickly, there's a slight dent in the state's imperviousness. However, the aforementioned military presence more than makes up for that geographic setback. It should be noted that California has some of the lowest gun ownership rates in the country, at only 28%. However, considering that
But that's the official number. There's probably, there's going to be people who own them that haven't registered them. They have them unlicensed, for certain reasons, I don't know. The number is probably higher than that in California with all the gangs and things like that.
The state has the largest population, at close to 39 million people. This is still a sizable number of people who own guns and are prepared to use them. Nevertheless, a bulk of the state's defense will come from its numerous troops rather than the civilian population. The next country on the list is the state that has the second largest population, Texas. The largest state in the contiguous US, Texas borders Mexico, and they both share a coast with the Gulf of Mexico. You might think this makes Texas practically defenseless and easy to invade, but while Texas might be relatively easy to access, invading it militarily is another thing altogether. Let's start with the state's geography. Most of the state is low-lying land. However, the state itself is absolutely huge, with roughly 270,000 square miles. This creates somewhat of a paradox. While the lack of natural barriers such as mountains makes the majority of the state easy to travel through, the sheer size of Texas makes invading it a burdensome endeavor.
God, I think the UK fits in Texas. At least once or twice. That's mad.
At the western part of the state is the beginning of the Sierra Madre Oriental, a part of the mountain chain that stretches from the north of North America to the south of South America. As a centrally positioned state, one of the major benefits of Texas is its connectivity with the rest of the US. The state has some of the country's busiest and largest airports and a significant highway infrastructure to connect it to both east and west coasts, as well as the northern part of the country. In fact, over 3,000 miles of interstate highway roads stretch across Texas, connecting its largest cities and industries. These highways can be readily converted to supply roads for the military. Since most of Texas is flat land, the military can move at a more rapid pace than in the mountainous states like Alaska and California, greatly speeding up response times. But what about this military presence in the state? Well, Texas has the third highest number of active military personnel, with around 112,000 troops. It also has roughly 24 military bases scattered throughout the state, which means military units can quickly travel to any corner of the state and beyond. Texas also has an estimated 56,000 reservists, bringing its military power above 170,000 troops during wartime. And that's not all. Texas is also a state with a high rate of gun ownership at 45.7%. This might not sound much compared to Alaska's 64%, but the difference lies in the Texan population. With over 30 million residents, this means close to 15 million people are armed and ready to defend their country.
That's a big one. That's a big one, because I remember I've seen videos of Americans doing paintballing, and the way they're so organized, it's like watching a military platoon or something. They took it so seriously. So if you say 1 out of every 5 Texans is regularly practicing and using their weapon, going to ranges and stuff, that's a lot of people. That's 3 million. So I think so. Yeah, that massively boosts the chances of defending themselves from an invading country.
When you finish running those numbers, the military might not even be necessary in the first place. Armed Texans themselves would outnumber any military in the world. Next on the list of states enemies really shouldn't mess with is the state that houses the country's largest city, New York. As one of the nation's major geopolitical, economic and...
Look at that skyline. It's incredible. It's insane. Look at the amount of skyscrapers.
population centers, New York City and the state it's in, you might suspect, would be well defended against an invasion, and that hunch would be correct. The Department of Defense has listed the state of New York as the 12th biggest recipient of national defense funding at $15.2 billion in 2023. The state doesn't have many active military personnel at around 17,000. Compared to the state's overall population of roughly 20 million, you get a ratio much lower than states like Texas and California are boasting. Arguably, the biggest reason as to why New York is so well defended lies in its geography. The state has ready access to the Atlantic Ocean on its south. To the north is the country's border with Canada, again exemplifying the benefit of having a NATO member neighbor who's ready to defend the US should it get invaded. The only possible vulnerability New York has is that the states to its east are not particularly well defended. Considering the importance of New York City, one of the state's aces up its sleeve is its road connections. The supply roads that stretch from New York City to practically every other major population center means the rest of the country is not far away by road. Perhaps even more importantly, the bulk of the US Navy's presence is centered around Washington, D.C. and neighboring states. This means that the US military has quick access to New York. Furthermore, if the state gets invaded via the Atlantic Ocean, the US Navy will effectively be able to mount a decisive counterattack from the south, cutting off the enemy's forces at the neck. Its geographical characteristics mean New York doesn't really need much military defense. The state is practically inaccessible by sea, with enemies having to go through the entire US Navy to attack its heart.
And you would have to think, after what happened in 2001, you would have to think that there's certain things in place that the public don't know about, like certain protections that have been, installed just in case anything was to happen. You'd have to assume that, that they're protecting that city even more now.
And there are far better targets around. Even if Canada ends up being the first line of attack, the connections between New York and Canada are not that advantageous. Furthermore, the state is practically split in half by the Adirondack and Catskill mountain ranges, as well as a portion of the Appalachian Mountains. Even if an invading force lands on the Atlantic shores or goes through Lake Ontario, the other half of the state is not easily accessible. In contrast, the state's extensive road system gives it a significant defensive edge, and New York City is a natural choke point. The next state on the list is Washington. The Pacific Coast state shares many similarities with both Alaska and California in terms of geography and connectivity. For one, the state's highly mountainous landscape is sharply contrasted with its fractured coastal region. Most of the state's largest cities lie on the Puget Sound Basin, a complex series of waterways that opens into the Strait of Juan de Fuca and then into the Pacific Ocean. This means that most of the state's population is well defended against an invasion. An enemy would have to either land on the Pacific coast, relatively far from major population centers, and then trek through the mountain region, or attempt to blockade the entire strait. Considering that the strait has openings on both sides of Vancouver Island, an invading force would practically have to occupy the island itself, which is under Canadian authority. Furthermore, the state's 10 military bases are pretty much concentrated around its major cities.
Having all these bases everywhere is such a great strategic play from the US military. It just means that you've got someone or a group of soldiers close by to pretty much the whole country. If anything happens anywhere, you can quickly get people like that. I don't think a lot of countries have that capability. A lot of countries don't have the money, frankly, to do it. But even us, the UK, with a really strong economy, I don't think we have anywhere near the number of military bases, like relative to the size of the country, as the US.
This is further complicated by the state's relatively large military presence. According to 2022 data, Washington contained roughly 60,000 active military personnel, putting it in 7th place nationwide. The state is also a significant supplier to the US Air Force, with Boeing being the primary military contractor in the state. Because of this, the US military would likely prioritize defending the state in the event of an enemy invasion. Because of its insular geography, Washington is not particularly well connected to other states in the contiguous US via roads. However, because it borders Canada, it's relatively close to Alaska via waterways and is on the same coast as California. It has more than enough of an edge compared to most other states in the region. The final entry on our list of states that are impossible to invade will likely be most surprising: Colorado. Truthfully, there's nothing really geographically impressive about Colorado.
I mean, the fact that it's right in the middle, because that means that a country would need to go through several other states, potentially being weakened by those other states before it got there.
It's not a large state or close to major population centers. What makes it difficult to invade is its location within the US. Colorado is hundreds of miles away from any coast or border to any other country. Add to that the fact that it lies pretty much inside the Rocky Mountains, and an invading force traversing both to and through the state is a futile endeavor. Colorado's military industry revolves around the Air Force, with the majority of its military bases serving that branch of the military. The state has a respectable number of active duty personnel at 38,000, but considering how difficult it is to get to Colorado from outside the US in any mode other than air, there's not really much of a need for many troops on the ground. The state is yet another Air Force supplier, with Lockheed Martin being the largest contractor in the state. In general, most states that have a large portion of their land area taken up by the Rocky Mountains or similar mountain ranges on the west coast have the same benefits as Colorado in terms of natural defenses. This makes an invasion from the west coast extremely difficult to accomplish, especially considering that Alaska, California, and Washington, and to a lesser extent Hawaii, create US Navy choke points that an incoming attack would first have to beat. Colorado is one of the states that is close to but not exactly on the west coast, yet has a large military presence, in this case the Air Force, and will likely have much more of an edge compared to its neighbors. So which would be the easiest states to invade? In general, states east of New York are arguably the least defended. The bulk of the US Navy on the east coast is centered around
the ones up here, right? The smaller ones, like Rhode Island, things like
protecting Washington, D.C., Florida, or Texas, while New York itself has a large mountainous shield to contend with. States like Connecticut, Rhode Island, or Maine are not that lucky. They are relatively isolated from the rest of the country, with most of the traffic that would come to these states needing to go through New York. That's part of why New York is so well defended, since it allows the US military access to these eastern states. But overall, there's practically no way for the US to be invaded. With the country boasting one of the world's largest, most technologically advanced, and well-funded militaries, the US's enemies would likely start any conflict by being on the back foot and being invaded first. This is supported by the fact that while the US spent the majority of its existence in a conflict against other countries, most of these conflicts were on foreign soil. Arguably, some analysts and strategists suggest that the only vulnerability the United States of America has lies in its very name, the United States. So long as the states work together, each will get unparalleled defenses. However, if states start drifting apart from one another, usually due to demographic and geopolitical divides, then there's no telling what would happen.
That could be why, there's so much interference with like elections and things. Like we hear about all of the bots from like Russia and other countries, trying to persuade people to vote this way and that way, trying to kind of split the country apart.
Fortunately for us, there's no viable process for a state to cede from the Union, so there's no prospect of an independent California or Texas putting a dent in the country's economy, military, or demographics. But on that note, the US is still the world's greatest superpower and is allied with most of the Western world through NATO. A war against the US would quickly result in alliances bringing other countries into the fray. With NATO's Article 5 in effect, an invading country would soon find themselves up against some of the biggest militaries and economies in the world working together. Those wars would likely need to end quickly or result in a resounding defeat for the enemies of the US. But what do you think? Are there any other states that deserve the
Great video, honestly. I think from a logical point of view, it's likely never going to happen. But you can never say never, can you? You can never say never. There have been really powerful, countries, empires, the Roman Empire, that they weren't invaded, but, at their height, nobody would have thought the Roman Empire was going to end. Not saying that the US, will ever end, but you can never sort of just be completely 100% sure. But the US in its current form, with the cooperation with NATO, with the alliances the US has, it's just super unlikely. Like the two countries that you would think that would ever even think of doing something like this, China and Russia. Russia nowhere near the military force that we thought it was. And China, I just don't think, like, they're too busy, thinking about their own sort of like, Taiwan and things like that. I just don't think they would ever want to do it because the US is such a big trading partner. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.